A millionaire CEO thought he had everything, until a starving little girl tugged his sleeve and whispered, "I just want milk for my brother." In that moment, his world shattered, but what he discovered next shook him even more. Before we dive in, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? Late evening had settled over the bustling city, where neon lights flickered across glass towers, and expensive cars glided past like shadows in motion, and in the middle of it all sat Ethan Carter, the 30-year-old millionaire CEO whose life had been defined by sharp decisions and ruthless ambition. Inside his glossy black luxury car, polished like a mirror, he adjusted the lapel of his royal blue tailored suit and glanced at his reflection in the rear view, the trimmed beard framing his strong jawline and his piercing blue eyes carrying the weight of unfinished meetings, pending contracts, and the endless chase for power. Yet for once his thoughts were not on profits, but on the gnawing silence of loneliness that crept in when the city slowed down. He loosened his tie, leaned back against the leather seat, and allowed himself the rare luxury of a sigh, when suddenly, knock knock, the faint sound of tiny fists against glass shattered his solitude, startling him into turning his head. There, pressed against the tinted window, was not a beggar or a vendor he might have brushed off in impatience, but a little girl no more than 6, her cheeks streaked with dirt, her eyelashes clumped from heavy tears, her trembling fingers leaving smudges on the immaculate surface of his car, and as she lifted her face to him, he saw desperation carved into her young features, the kind that no child should ever wear, her lips moving with effort until a whisper broke through the glass, fragile and aching. "Sir, I just want milk for my brother." Ethan froze, his breath catching in his throat, his sharp blue eyes locking on hers as though the world around them had fallen away. The honking cars, the glittering skyline, the relentless pulse of the city, all faded, leaving only the sight of this trembling child and the haunting plea in her voice. His hand, almost reluctant, reached for the window, controls. And as the glass lowered, cold evening air rushed in, carrying with it the sharp scent of rain mixed with the faint mustiness of unwashed clothes clinging to her, and only then did Ethan notice what his heart refused at first to believe. Strapped to her small back with a torn strip of cloth was a boy, barely 2 years old, his head drooping against her shoulder, his skin pale, lips cracked, and chest rising and falling with shallow breaths, a silent picture of hunger and exhaustion that struck Ethan like a blow. He blinked hard, struggling to reconcile the sight with the opulence of his own life. Just moments ago he had been debating which wine to open at home, and now before him stood a sister fighting for her brother's survival, a child forced into motherhood by cruelty and neglect. Ethan's throat tightened as his gaze drifted back to the girl's eyes, wide and shimmering with tears that refused to stop, and in them he read a courage far greater than her fragile frame, the kind of strength born not from privilege but from unbearable suffering, and for reasons he could not yet explain something inside him cracked, a long-buried ache clawing to the surface, whispering that this moment was not an accident, that destiny had led her to his car, his window, his life, and as she pressed her tiny palms closer, whispering again with a voice almost gone, "Please, sir, just milk for my brother." Ethan Carter, the man who had built empires and broken rivals without flinching, felt the walls around his heart begin to crumble. The girl's words lingered in the air like a dagger through silence, her trembling voice carrying a pain far too heavy for such young shoulders. And Ethan, a man celebrated for conquering boardrooms and dismantling rivals with icy precision, found himself disarmed by the innocence of a child begging not for riches, not for toys, but for the simplest mercy of milk to soothe her starving brother, a request so pure it tore at the core of his carefully constructed armor. His fingers froze mid-air, the instinctive shields of pride and indifference, falling away as he studied the hollow cheeks of the toddler barely breathing against her back, the way his frail hand twitched faintly, searching for comfort even in sleep, and Ethan's chest burned with an unfamiliar ache, one that stripped him of his identity as CEO and left him only as a man facing the raw cruelty of a world that could abandon children. His voice, usually commanding and sharp, softened to a whisper as he forced out, "Where are your parents, little one?" And the response that came shattered whatever fragments of control he still clung to, for her quivering lips, coated in dust, formed words no child should ever have to repeat. "Mama is in the hospital. Stepdad kicked us out. He said, "Find milk for your brother. You both are not mine." Her shoulders shook as she said it, her eyes darting to her brother as if afraid even the memory of rejection might harm him further. And Ethan's jaw locked tight, the veins in his temple throbbing as rage flared against sorrow inside him. The injustice of it suffocating, the cruelty of a man turning away from a woman's children as though they were disposable, igniting a storm within him. And yet in that very storm came a strange clarity, because beneath the fury, he felt something sharper, something almost personal, as though fate itself was mocking him with a mirror of mistakes he once made. Swallowing hard, he shoved open the heavy car door, the street air striking him cold, and for the first time in years, Ethan Carter, the untouchable millionaire, knelt upon the hard pavement, lowering himself until he was eye level with the girl, until she could see that behind the wealth and steel exterior was a man undone, his breath uneven as he reached out and gently touched the fragile hand of the boy strapped to her back, the boy's skin paper-thin, cold against his warmth, a contrast so stark it made his heart convulse, and in that moment Ethan's world tilted, the bustling city around him blurring into irrelevance, the passers-by reduced to shadows, the engines to muffled echoes, because all that mattered was the truth in front of him. 2 lives discarded, 2 souls clinging to hope, and 1 decision that could change everything. Ethan gathered the children with trembling care, his powerful hands suddenly unsure as they lifted the fragile weight of hunger and sorrow, settling them gently into the plush leather of his car that had only ever carried polished executives and empty victories. And as the engine hummed to life, its familiar roar felt alien, for tonight it was not a symbol of wealth, but a vessel carrying broken innocence toward hope. Reaching into the sleek compartment where he usually stored documents and luxury pens, he pulled out the simplest thing he had, snacks from his office bag, and placed them into the girl's tiny hands, watching her fingers shake as though she feared the food might vanish if she blinked, her gratitude spilling through tears as she tore the wrapper with trembling urgency and pressed the bite-sized pieces into her brother's mouth before tasting any herself, her devotion wrapping around Ethan's heart like chains he could not break. The boy whimpered faintly, swallowing with difficulty, and Ethan felt a pang deep within him, a guilt he could not name, as though this child's suffering were not only the fault of a cruel stepfather, but of a world he himself had turned away from. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel, guiding the car through streets that blurred beneath neon signs and street lamps, but his ears were not filled with engines or horns. They were filled with the quiet sobs of the little girl beside him, each sound slicing through the silence, until her voice, broken but determined, escaped in words that seemed too heavy for her age. "Mama said my real daddy was kind, but he left before I was born. Stepdad doesn't love us. He said we're trash." The sentence echoed in Ethan's chest like a cruel bell tolling, each word a hammer strike against a conscience he had long silenced, and though his face remained forward, his knuckles whitened against the wheel, his throat tightening until breath itself became a battle, for her words did not merely describe abandonment. They accused, they unveiled, they begged for answers he dared not speak. He glanced at her through the corner of his eye, at those deep brown eyes glistening under the dim interior lights, eyes that should have been filled with play and dreams, but instead carried the weary shadows of rejection, and in them he saw something disturbingly familiar, a reflection he could not yet place, as if a piece of himself stared back at him through the innocence of a child he had only just met. The realization stirred a storm within, memory fragments clawing at his mind, whispers of a past he had buried under ambition, but he forced them down, telling himself it could not be. It was coincidence, and yet the weight in his chest grew heavier with every mile, every sob, every desperate word spilling from her lips, until at last he whispered silently into the hum of the car, not for her to hear, but for his own soul to confess. "God, why does she feel like mine?" The drive felt endless, yet in truth it lasted only minutes, and when Ethan screeched to a halt before the hospital's glaring entrance lights, he lifted the children in his arms as though they were glass, striding past the startled stares of nurses and patients, his expensive shoes clicking sharply against the sterile floors until he burst into the ward Emma had been placed in, and there, on a narrow bed under harsh fluorescent light, lay a woman whose face he knew as well as his own, though time and suffering had stolen its glow. Her skin was pale, her breathing shallow, yet through the frailty lingered a beauty that memory had never allowed him to forget, and when her eyelids fluttered open, when her weary gaze finally met his, the universe itself seemed to fall silent. "Emma." His voice cracked, unguarded, as though all the years of anger and pride had dissolved in that single moment, and her lips parted in disbelief, trembling around his name as if speaking it might cost her the last of her strength. "Ethan, why are you here?" The sound of her voice was a blade and a balm, slicing through the shell he had built but soothing a wound that had ached for years, and beside him, little Lila blinked with wide confusion, looking from her mother's frail body to the powerful man who held her hand just moments ago, whispering with innocence untouched by the secrets of the past. "Mama, this is the man who gave us food." Emma's eyes flickered, shimmering with sudden tears as her fragile fingers reached out, hesitating in the air as though afraid he might vanish. And Ethan, trembling for the first time in decades, stepped closer, every heartbeat hammering with the weight of memories, the nights they laughed together, the vows he swore, the day he let suspicion and pride poison their love, the bitter decision that tore them apart, and the years he forced himself to believe he had been right when, deep down, he always knew he had lost more than a wife. He had lost his only true home. The room held its breath, the hum of machines echoing like distant drums as Emma's frailty clashed with Ethan's guilt. And though no words passed between them beyond her trembling question, the silence screamed louder than any argument, a silence that demanded answers, forgiveness, truth, and the courage to face what they had both buried, while Lila, innocent yet perceptive, sensed the storm between them, clutching her brother tighter against her chest, her gaze darting between them with a child's unspoken question. What bound her mother to this stranger who suddenly seemed not so strange at all? Ethan demanded. "Answers," his voice trembling, not from anger but from the weight of years he could never recover, and Emma, with tears rolling endlessly down her pale cheeks, confessed the secret that had lived in silence for far too long, whispering between breaths that Lila was his daughter, that the night he had walked out in blind rage and shattered trust, she had discovered she was carrying his child, but pride and distance had turned every attempt to reach him into empty echoes, and as the years passed, she had remarried hoping that perhaps another man would give the little girl a father's embrace, only for fate to twist cruelly, gifting her daughter rejection, pain, and the scars of being unwanted. And Ethan staggered back at the revelation, his royal blue suit no longer the symbol of power, but a fragile shell around a man whose soul had just been pierced open, for the truth ripped through him like a storm tearing roofs from houses, and he realized in that devastating instant that while he had been building empires and drowning in wealth, his own flesh and blood had been begging strangers for milk on the streets, and the weight of his failures broke him to his knees before the small girl whose innocence made her undeserving of the torment life had dealt, his voice collapsing into a whisper as he looked into her wide brown eyes and choked out the words, "I am your father, forgive me, princess." And the room thickened with silence heavy enough to crush the strongest hearts, Emma covering her face as sobs racked her fragile body, while Lila blinked, confusion clouding her expression, her lips parting with the quietest of voices. You're my daddy?" And Ethan nodded through tears he could not stop, trembling as he reached out but stopping halfway, unsure if he had the right, unsure if she would allow him into her world. And then the little girl, innocent yet wise beyond her years from surviving neglect, stepped forward and placed her tiny hands on his wet face, whispering, "I just wanted milk, not hate." And those words shattered him more than any revelation could, and her simplicity. She had spoken the truth of years of suffering, and Ethan broke into a sob that shook his body, clutching her small frame as if she were the only treasure he had ever desired, promising with every tear that he would never let go again, while Emma watched, her heart torn between relief that the truth was out and pain that it had taken so long, whispering softly that she never hated him, that all she had ever wanted was for him to trust her. And Ethan turned toward her, his voice hoarse, saying he was sorry for every false accusation, every cruel word, every night she had cried alone, and Emma's lips trembled with the hint of forgiveness, though her body was still frail and her time uncertain, and the doctors came rushing in, urging her to rest, but she refused to close her eyes, holding both Ethan's and Lila's hands together, forcing their palms to meet, as though sealing a bond that should never again be broken, whispering, "Promise me you won't fail her." And Ethan swore on everything he had, not as a billionaire, not as a powerful man, but as a father desperate to redeem himself, swore that he would love, protect, and cherish his daughter until his last breath, and Lila, with tears streaking her cheeks, nodded slowly, her little heart daring to hope, whispering that she wanted her daddy home, not money, not gifts, just home. And Ethan vowed aloud that home was wherever she was, and for the first time since the shadows of betrayal had destroyed them, a fragile warmth spread through the cold room, a light of reconciliation and fragile hope glowing even against the walls of despair, and Emma finally closed her eyes, not from surrender but from peace, knowing her daughter had found her father at last, while Ethan held Lila tighter, his heart breaking and healing at once, whispering again and again, "Forgive me, princess, forgive me." And though years of absence could never be erased, the purity of a child's embrace began stitching wounds no riches ever could. And as dawn broke outside the hospital window, painting the sky in gold and crimson, Ethan realized that life had given him a second chance, not to rebuild his empire, but to rebuild his family, and with every heartbeat he silently vowed he would never waste it again, because for the first time in years, he was not just a man in a royal blue suit, he was a father. Ethan's vow echoed in the hospital walls like a promise carved into eternity, and with every passing day he turned that vow into action, confronting not only Emma's cruel step-husband, but also the demons of his own pride, storming into courtrooms with the fire of a man who had finally found his purpose, stripping away the legal bindings that had once left Emma powerless, and ensuring no document, no signature, no sneering face could ever threaten their family again, while outside the courtrooms, he poured his fortune like a river into Emma's treatment, refusing to let money be the wall between life and death, sitting at her bedside as machines beeped steadily, brushing her hair from her forehead, whispering stories of the past that once divided them, now desperate to stitch them back together, and in the quiet nights he carried her little boy in his arms until he fell asleep, rocked by the heartbeat of a father he never knew he had, while holding Lila's small hand like a lifeline, her tiny fingers gripping him tighter each evening as if testing whether he would truly stay. And though her heart still carried the scars of hunger and rejection, she dared to whisper one trembling night, "Daddy, will you leave again?" A question that shattered Ethan's heart more than any courtroom battle, more than any cruel word spoken in anger, and with tears flooding his blue eyes he pulled her close, his voice shaking but firm as he swore, "Never again. I will fight the world for you and your brother." And from that moment on he lived like a man reborn, waking early to cook breakfast even if the toast burned, helping Lila with schoolwork he once thought beneath his busy life, carrying his son on his shoulders through hospital corridors so the boy could laugh above the sadness, while Emma, slowly regaining strength, watched from her bed with tears glistening, her heart torn between the pain of what they lost and the beauty of what was being rebuilt. And when Lila finally called him Daddy, without hesitation, when the boy reached for him in sleep, Ethan realized redemption wasn't found in his billions or his power, but in the simple, sacred act of staying, of being present, of protecting without condition. And so as Emma's color returned, as laughter cautiously crept back into the children's voices, Ethan stood taller, not as a CEO, not as a man of wealth, but as a father, as a protector, as the one who had finally learned that true victory was not in conquering the world, but in never letting go of the hands that once begged him for milk, now holding him like the center of their universe. And in that embrace, he knew his fight was not just for redemption, it was for love, for family, for forever. Weeks later, Emma's strength returned like the first bloom of spring after a brutal winter, her laughter once faint now echoing softly through the grand halls of Ethan's mansion, a place that had once felt empty despite its splendor, but now pulsed with the warmth of life and family. And as she stood in the sprawling garden bathed in golden sunlight, watching Lila chase butterflies while her baby brother toddled unsteadily across the grass, she felt a peace she had never dared to dream of, a peace born not of wealth or grandeur, but of safety, healing, and the quiet miracle of being loved. Ethan approached, his usually firm and commanding stride slowed into something tender, almost hesitant, as though he feared breaking the fragile beauty of the moment. And when he reached her, he gently took her hand, not as a man who had conquered empires, but as one who had been conquered by love, his voice breaking yet strong with truth as he whispered that he had failed her once in arrogance and blindness, that he had turned away from the very soul who had carried his light. But now he begged for a second chance, not in the cold title of CEO, not in the hollow pride of a millionaire, but in the humble vow of a father who would protect their children with his last breath, and as a husband who finally understood that love was not ownership but sacrifice, not wealth but kindness, not distance but presence. And Emma, who had carried years of rejection, loneliness, and quiet strength, felt her heart tremble as tears slid down her cheeks, not from pain this time, but from the strange sweetness of hope, her lips unable to form words, yet her silent nod carrying the weight of forgiveness and new beginnings. In that moment, Lila squealed with joy, her little voice slicing through the air like music, calling "Daddy," as her legs carried her forward, and Ethan bent down with arms wide open, catching her mid-run and lifting her high into the sky as she laughed, her brother clapping his tiny hands from the grass, and Ethan's chest ached with a love so fierce it humbled him to his knees, for in that embrace he felt the innocence of childhood restored, the bridge between past failures and future promises built by nothing more than trust. And as Emma stepped closer, placing a gentle hand over his shoulder, the four of them drew into a circle unbroken, a family reborn not by chance but by choice. And Ethan realized that for the first time in years, he no longer felt like the untouchable millionaire the world revered. He felt something infinitely greater. He felt like a father whose daughter's trust was a crown heavier than any corporate empire, a husband whose wife's forgiveness was a treasure worth more than all his wealth, a man who had stumbled through arrogance only to be redeemed by love and humanity. And as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Emmy leaned her head against him while the children's laughter danced in the breeze, and together they watched the horizon with hearts unshackled, knowing that broken families can indeed heal when love triumphs over pride, when forgiveness conquers regret, and when kindness proves itself the richest legacy of all.